In a small, peaceful town in America, Mrs. Elizabeth lived quietly in a modest little house, but one filled with memories. Her life is the clearest testament to the resilience and unconditional sacrifice of a mother. She is not only the pillar of the family, but also an endless source of love for her three children, John, Emily, and Michael. Many years ago, Elizabeth's life was completely turned upside down when her husband passed away in an unexpected accident, leaving her alone to raise three small children. Coming from a poor working-class family, she had little opportunity for education, but that did not stop her from becoming an exemplary mother. She worked tirelessly, from sewing and gardening to selling small goods, to earn money for her children's education. Her personality is gentle, always living simply and frugally. Even though life was difficult, she never complained or grumbled. For her, the greatest happiness is not wealth, but seeing her children grow up healthy, successful, and having their own lives. She is willing to sacrifice everything for a better future for them. When the children grew up, each one left home to build their own life. John became a successful entrepreneur. Emily was busy with her small family, and Michael pursued a vibrant life in the big city. Although proud of her children, Mrs. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. The house that once echoed with the laughter and chatter of the family is now left with only silence. Each day of hers passes in simple repetition. She takes care of the small garden behind the house, where she grows the types of flowers her children used to love. She cooks by herself, although most of the time it's just meals for one. In the late afternoons, she often sat by the window, looking at the road in front of the house, hoping to see the familiar figures of her children visiting. Mrs. Elizabeth's house, though simple, is always decorated with family photos. On the wall is a photo of the whole family when the children were small, their smiles in the picture always making her feel warm, but it couldn't fill the loneliness. Each photo is a precious piece of memory that she often gazes at when feeling empty, as if to hold on to the happy moments that have passed. For Mrs. Elizabeth, this small house is not just a place to live, but also a repository of everything she cherishes most: memories of family, love, and the silent sacrifices she has made for her children. But the more she loved and sacrificed, the more she felt the loneliness as the people she had devoted her life to caring for grew increasingly distant. Your indifference becomes more and more apparent as time goes by. Although Mrs. Elizabeth never complained, her heart silently bore the sorrow of realizing that her love and sacrifices were not met with the care she always longed for. John, the eldest son, often uses the excuse of being busy with business to avoid visiting his mother. Each of his calls was the same, brief, with simple pleasantries, as if just to fulfill an obligation. Nevertheless, Mrs. Elizabeth was always delighted whenever she received a call from John, even if it was just for a few brief minutes. "You're fine. That's enough for me," she said, though deep down, she still wished to hear a bit more about his life. But John often hurriedly ended the call with a phrase, "I'm in a meeting, Mom. Take care of your health." Emily, the second daughter, always has a reasonable excuse for not visiting her mother, busy taking care of her small family, taking her child to school, or handling unnamed tasks in daily life. Every time she received a message from her mother, Emily would usually respond half-heartedly, "I'll make time, Mom." But every time, that promise never became a reality. Mrs. Elizabeth understood that Emily had her own responsibilities, but deep down, she still hoped her daughter would spare a little time for her. Michael, the youngest son, was the one she had hoped would maintain the closest bond with her. But living in a big city with a modern lifestyle, Michael gradually became distant. His grandmother's messages, though full of love and concern, were often ignored or replied to with a brief, "I'm busy, I'll call you later." But Michael's later never comes. There were important occasions like her birthday that Michael didn't even remember, leaving her. Every time she looked at her phone, Waiting for news from her children, Mrs. Elizabeth couldn't hide her disappointment. But instead of blaming them, she reassured herself, "They are busy. I shouldn't disturb them." At night, when the small house sank into darkness, she lay alone, reminiscing about the old days when her children were small, gathered around her, and wondered, do they ever think of their mother now? Although the loneliness grew stronger, Mrs. Elizabeth still kept the habit of preparing small gifts for her children on holidays. She meticulously knitted woolen scarves for winter, baked cookies for Christmas, and wrapped each gift with all her love. But those gifts often only received hasty thanks, or sometimes no response at all. The days passed in silence and fragile hope. Mrs. Elizabeth continued to wait, believing that one day her children would realize and return to her, just like the old days. But time does not wait, and your indifference only makes her more lonely in her world full of memories. Mrs. Elizabeth's mood gradually becomes heavier whenever a holiday approaches. Holidays are supposed to be times when families gather together, but for her, they are the days when loneliness becomes most apparent. In the small house, she quietly decorated a corner of the table with the old ornaments she had kept for many years. The lights flickered and the wreaths were no longer shiny, but she still carefully arranged them, as if waiting for something special to happen. Mrs. Elizabeth never stopped hoping that, even just once, her children would appear unexpectedly, bringing her the warm feeling of the old days. Every morning during the holiday season, she would often look out the window, gazing down the road in front of her house, hoping to see the familiar figure of someone visiting. But day after day, the road remained desolate, with no sign that her children would return. However, she never let disappointment completely take over her soul. She continued to do small things that she believed would make her children feel her love. The gifts she prepared were not luxurious items, but handmade things made with all her heart. Once, she knitted John a dark blue scarf because she remembered he used to like that color. For Emily, she meticulously embroidered a small handkerchief because Emily once said they were elegant and lovely. As for Michael, she baked the almond cookies that he used to love the most when he was little. But when those gifts were sent, they often did not receive a sincere response. John just replied briefly, "Thank you, Mom." Emily called, but her voice was hurried, as if it were something she needed to get done. As for Michael, sometimes he even forgets to say thank you, leaving her with an indescribable silence. On holiday evenings, Mrs. Elizabeth sat at the dining table, looking at the empty chair she had once reserved for her children, and the feeling of emptiness in her heart seemed to spread throughout the room. She tried to smile, telling herself that her children all had valid reasons, that she shouldn't expect too much. But deep down, she could not deny a heartbreaking truth: how much she missed her children, and the love she had for them seemed no longer strong enough to bring them back to her. Instead of blaming, Mrs. Elizabeth chose to live with the memories. The family photos on the wall became her only source of comfort. Sometimes she quietly talks to the photographs, as if her children were still there, laughing and sharing with her. But when the clock chimes in the night, she returns to the reality that she is alone facing the emptiness in the very house that used to be filled with laughter. That afternoon, Mrs. Elizabeth sat in the chair by the window, her gaze fixed on the road in front of the house. Every time she heard the sound of an engine from afar, her heart would beat faster, hoping that one of her children would appear, bringing a smile and congratulations. But the sound of the car quickly faded away, leaving the road empty and enveloped in silence. When the sun began to set, she picked up her phone, waiting for a message or call from her children. The first message came from John, the eldest son. The short message, "Happy birthday, Mom." "I'm very busy," appeared on the screen. There were no promises or any emotions, just a cold, polite greeting. She forced a smile, telling herself that at least John still remembered this day, even if it was just through a text message. Not long after that, Emily texted, "Mom, I'm sorry, I have family matters today. I can't come home. Happy birthday, Mom." That message was exactly like the words Emily often said whenever she refused to visit her mother. She understood that Emily had her own family and the responsibilities of a mother, but that did not ease the growing sadness in her heart. All evening, she kept waiting for Michael, her youngest son, but the phone never rang. Not a single call, not a single message, just silence. She knew Michael had a busy lifestyle, and that had made him forget his mother's birthday. When the clock struck 8 p.m., Mrs. Elizabeth decided to light the candles on the birthday cake she had baked herself. The light from the tiny candles flickered in the silent room, reflecting on her wrinkled face. She sat down at the table, in front of the cold dishes, and 3 empty chairs still waiting for someone to sit. In that silence, she softly sang the happy birthday song for herself. Her voice trembled and choked, as if she couldn't finish the song. When the song ended, she gently blew out the candles, praying a simple wish that she knew would never come true. "I hope you will come back." Silent tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at the uncut birthday cake. The atmosphere in the small house became heavier than ever, as if all the hopes she had devoted herself to over the past week had vanished in an instant. That night, Mrs. Elizabeth sat for a long time in the dark, looking at the family photos on the wall, where her children were still smiling in happy memories. But those memories now belong only to her, while the people she loved most have drifted too far away, both in distance and in heart. A few months after that lonely birthday, silence enveloped Mrs. Elizabeth's small house. Mrs. Elizabeth, who used to regularly tend to her garden, walk around the neighborhood, and greet her neighbors, suddenly stopped appearing as usual. Her neighbor, Mrs. Martha, noticed something unusual when the mailbox in front of Mrs. Elizabeth's house became increasingly full. Dry leaves covered the walkway, and the windows of the house remained tightly shut for many days. At first, Martha thought that perhaps Mrs. Elizabeth was not feeling well and needed to rest. But when a week passed without any signs of Mrs. Elizabeth leaving the house, Mrs. Martha's worry grew. Finally, she decided to call the police to check on the situation. When the police arrived, the small house was still as quiet as ever. The door was opened, and inside, everything seemed to remain just as Mrs. Elizabeth had arranged it last time. The dining table still had a vase of dried flowers. The family photos were polished and neatly arranged, as if she were still waiting for someone to visit. They found Mrs. Elizabeth sitting in her familiar armchair, her body motionless but her face serene, as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. In her hands was the book she had been reading, with her reading glasses neatly placed beside it. What remains of her is not only the tranquility of a mother who has devoted her life to her children, but also the silence of someone who has faced loneliness throughout her final days. The police delivered the sad news to her children. This news hit John, Emily, and Michael like a shock. They were shocked to realize that their mother had passed away without anyone by her side. The 3 of them hurriedly arranged their work to return to the house where they had grown up, carrying a heavy feeling and a hint of vague regret. When they stepped into the house, the cold and silent atmosphere seemed to emphasize the permanent absence of the mother they had forgotten. On the table next to the armchair, Mrs. Elizabeth's unfinished book and her reading glasses still remained, like a painful reminder of her quietude in her final days. The house, once filled with laughter and warm memories, now only remains as fragments of the past, making each child's heart even heavier. But even though they felt the great loss, none of them could immediately realize that their indifference was the reason Mrs. Elizabeth left in solitude. John stepped into the familiar house he hadn't visited in a long time, his gaze sweeping over every corner of the room. every familiar item that his mother had always kept meticulously. The house, though small and simple, still carries the warmth of Mrs. Elizabeth. However, now that warmth is just a distant memory. Although the news of his mother's passing left him stunned, John tried to remain calm. He told himself that he had fulfilled his role as a son, providing financial support when needed, occasionally calling to check in. But when his gaze fell upon the armchair where his mother used to sit, with the unfinished book in her hands, a strange feeling of emptiness suddenly welled up in his heart. He suddenly realized that all these years, he had only fulfilled his superficial responsibilities without caring about what his mother truly needed. Genuine concern and time spent with her. Emily stepped into the house right after John, and when she saw the dining table still neatly arranged by her mother with a vase of wilted flowers, tears streamed down her cheeks. Memories of the times her mother called, texted her to come visit, but she refused with excuses like, "Mom, I'm very busy." "Next time, I promise I'll come home," suddenly flooded back like a tidal wave. The next time she had promised turned out to never come. She burst into tears, sat down on the chair next to the dining table, covered her face, and murmured, "Mom, I'm sorry. I have not fulfilled my duty. You made your mother lonely." The regret tore her heart apart, but now all apologies have become meaningless, for the mother she loved has left forever. Michael, the youngest son, was the last to arrive. When he stepped into the house, he stood motionless at the door, his gaze fixed on the familiar items, the gifts he knew his mother had prepared for him on every holiday, now still lying on the shelf, never opened by him. He collapsed, his hands clutching his head, tears silently falling. In his mind, Michael couldn't stop blaming himself for forgetting his mother's last birthday. He recalled the ignored messages, the calls he made excuses to avoid, and above all, he remembered his indifference when he knew his mother was always waiting without ever responding. "Mom waited for me, but I wasn't there," he murmured, his voice full of pain. 3 children, each with their own emotions, but all sharing a common pain. They let their mother leave in loneliness, which they could have prevented. The small house is no longer a place filled with love, but has become a heavy space of memories and regrets that none of them can erase. A few days after the funeral, Mrs. Elizabeth's 3 children sat down with the family lawyer to read the will she left behind. In the quiet atmosphere of the room, tension enveloped every gaze. They do not know that what they are about to hear will completely change the way they see their mother and themselves. The lawyer began to open the documents, his voice steady. Mrs. Elizabeth's will is not just her final words, but also a gift and a lesson she wanted to leave for her children. All 3 listened quietly as the lawyer continued to read, "I, Elizabeth, leave all my assets, including the house in town, real estate in the city, shares in companies, and savings, with an estimated total value of millions of dollars, to the charity that cares for lonely elderly people and orphaned children." John frowned, not believing his ears. Emily placed her hand on her chest, tears falling again. As for Michael, who had been silent, he clenched his fists as if trying to hold back his emotions. The lawyer continued reading, his voice slowing down before each word. "My dear children, your mother has sacrificed her whole life for you to have a good life, but in the end, she realized that love cannot be bought with wealth. Mother wants what she has to go to those who need it more, those who will cherish the love, just as she had once hoped from you." The room was engulfed in silence, but within each person was a storm of emotions. John, who always prided himself on his success and control, now feels like everything is falling apart. He never thought that his mother, who lived so simply that he believed she had no significant assets, actually owned such a large fortune. But what shocked him even more was his mother's decision. She had given everything to someone else, not to her own children. Emily, who once made excuses about being busy with family, now realizes that her mother saw through her indifference. The words in the will were like a wake-up call, making her more acutely aware of the emptiness in the way she had lived for her mother. Michael couldn't lift his head. The words in the will kept echoing in his mind, "Love cannot be bought with wealth." He knew that his mother didn't need their wealth or success, but only genuine care, something he had never given her. After finishing reading, the lawyer gently folded the will. He turned to the three children, his gaze contemplative but not judgmental. "This is not a punishment. This is the message your mother wanted to leave, that love and care are priceless. She chose to use her wealth to spread that message." Three children sat silently. They no longer felt the loss of wealth, but a greater pain, losing the final opportunity to express their love for their mother. The enormous wealth they once thought was a symbol of success has now become a bitter reminder of the true value of family, love, and connection. From that day on, the lives of all three changed forever. They could not change the past, but they knew that their mother's last words would forever be etched in their hearts, like a lesson they would never forget. John sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the will, but the words seemed to blur before his eyes. He couldn't believe that his simple, frugal mother, whom he once thought had nothing but a small house, actually owned a vast fortune. That truth left him stunned, but what pained him even more was realizing that he had never understood his mother. He recalled the times he hurriedly ended calls with his mother, only to return to contracts and meetings that he deemed more important. John always told himself that as long as he provided financial support when needed, it was enough to fulfill his duty as a son. But now, when facing his mother's last words, he realizes that money means nothing without care and love. Emily sat across from John, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't stop crying. Each tear was a piece of memory flooding back. The times her mother called to check on her, but she refused because she was busy. The gifts her mother sent that she only thanked her for half-heartedly without ever cherishing. "Mom loved me so much, sacrificed her whole life for me, yet I couldn't even spare a little time for her," she murmured, choked with emotion. The regret tormented her, making her feel as if she were being crushed by an indelible remorse. She wondered, if she could go back, would she have done it differently? But now, it's all too late. Michael bowed his head, not saying a word. The will lay before him, but he didn't have the courage to look at it again. He knows best how much he has disappointed his mother. In the last days of his mother's life, when she was waiting for a call, a birthday wish, he completely forgot. "Mom had hoped for me, but I ignored all the signs," he thought, his heart heavy. His indifference not only hurt his mother, but also became a deep-seated pain in his soul. He couldn't stop blaming himself, but that feeling of collapse didn't ease the fact that his mother had left forever without him having the chance to say a word of apology. Three children sat silently in the room, not a word spoken among them. They all clearly felt that the loss was not just their mother, but also the last opportunity to make amends. Each person faces their own pain, but the empathy in their regret is the only thing connecting them at this moment. In that moment, they realized that wealth or success could not compensate for family affection. A mother's love is priceless, but they let it slip through their fingers, leaving an emptiness that can never be filled. After the reading of the will, all three children left their mother's house, but their hearts were no longer the same as before. In the following days, each person sank into their own thoughts, confronting the regret they could not avoid. John, who always took pride in his success and busyness, now realizes that his achievements at work cannot fill the void left by his mother. He felt a strange emptiness, not because of the loss of wealth, but because of the lost opportunity to express love to his mother. He began to reflect on his life, the hurried calls, the times he brushed off his mother's inquiries because of work, and he realized that his mother didn't need money or fame, but only his presence. Emily, who always made excuses about being busy with her small family, now faces her greatest regret. She looked at her two children and wondered, will they treat me the same way I treated my mother when I grow old? The memories of the promises she had never fulfilled kept tormenting her, making her unable to find peace. She began to realize that spending time with loved ones is not a responsibility, but a precious gift that both the giver and the receiver can enjoy. Michael, the youngest son, who had missed all the opportunities to be close to his mother, now carries an unhealable wound in his heart. He can't stop thinking about the days his mother sat alone, waiting for a call, a birthday wish from him, but he did nothing. His indifference not only hurt his mother, but also became the greatest pain of his life. He told himself that from now on, he would never repeat this mistake with anyone in his life. All three children realized that their mother's love was priceless, and now, after losing her, they understand that nothing in the world can replace it. The wealth they once pursued has now become meaningless as they realize that the most precious thing, family bonds, had been overlooked by them. They felt an immeasurable loss. Mom has passed away, and with her, the chance to make amends has also vanished forever. No more holidays for them to come back, no more small gifts sent by mother, and no more gentle inquiries over the phone. The small house, once a warm and loving home, now holds only memories and loneliness. From their mother's passing, they learned a profound lesson. Family affection cannot be postponed, cannot wait for when there is time, and cannot be measured by material possessions or outward responsibilities. They understand that when there is an opportunity to love and to spend time, it must be seized immediately, because once it slips away, all apologies become meaningless. These echoes are not only regrets, but also reminders, a great lesson that their mother left behind. And in that emptiness, all three children were determined to change, not just for themselves, but also to preserve the legacy of love their mother had dedicated her entire life to building. The story of Mrs. Elizabeth is not just a family tragedy, but also a profound reminder of the true value of family affection. In modern life, when people are caught up in the whirlwind of work, fame, and personal concerns, family ties are often set aside. But Mrs. Elizabeth's story emphasizes that family affection is the most precious thing, a treasure that cannot be exchanged for any success or wealth. Mrs. Elizabeth dedicated her entire life to loving and sacrificing for her children. But what she desired was not a reward in money or material things, but simply care and a little time spent with the people she loved the most. But in the final years of her life, she realized that this, for her children, had become a luxury. Her passing is a wake-up call for each of us. Cherish your loved ones while you still can. Don't wait until you have time. Don't make excuses that work is busy or life is too stressful, because time doesn't stop for us to fix our mistakes. Once a loved one has passed away, every opportunity to express love and make amends will be forever lost. Elizabeth's final words in her will were the clearest message. Love cannot be bought with wealth. Family affection cannot be measured by material wealth, nor can it be replaced by success or riches. It can only be nurtured by small but sincere actions. A phone call to check in, an afternoon spent sharing a meal, or simply words of love. This story reminds us that each of us can become John, Emily, or Michael, people caught up in the rhythm of life and forgetting what is truly important. But we can also choose to live differently. Spend time with family, express our feelings to parents and siblings, so we don't have to face regret when it's too late. That message is not only for Mrs. Elizabeth's 3 children, but also for all of us. Family affection is not only the bond that connects generations, but also a source of strength, a refuge when life is full of storms. Hold on tightly to that bond, for once it breaks, all that remains is an unfillable void. Remember, Family affection is a gift, not an obligation, and gifts once lost can never be regained.